it will be pretty hard for me to cover exceptions in just one video, so I will probably break this down into 2, maybe even 3 videos. I see tutorials where I think they go into code too quickly, and that can get confusing or intimidating if you don't have a good understanding of the basic terms. So let's start there. What's an exception? It's like an error of sorts. This is Oracle's definition. It's an event which occurs during the execution of a program that disrupts the normal flow of the program's instructions. So your program shouldn't expect exceptions, but it should definitely prepare for them. And exceptions in Java are objects. And while you don't need to memorize too many things when learning to code, I think it'd be a good idea to maybe just memorize the hierarchy for exceptions. And every kind of exception you see here is a subclass of the class Throwable. Throwable is a class, not just an interface. And so this gives us some methods we can use in our exception classes because of inheritance. If you don't understand inheritance, then this might not make much sense, but so you should probably stop the video and research that a bit first. But exception inherits from Throwable, and so these are some goodies we get from the Throwable class. Print stack trace, get message, get cause, and there's more, of course, but these are one of the more commonly used ones. The name is appropriate, throwable. In order for your program to be able to throw an object, that object must be throwable, meaning it must be an instance of the class Throwable or a subclass of Throwable, which is what the exception and error classes are. I have exceptions here, but it's not exceptions, it's the exception class, no S there. So that's just a typo. And I'm not going to really talk about errors other than to say that according to the official docs, an error indicates serious problems that a reasonable application should not try to catch. So we don't need to worry about throwing or catching errors. So as I said, the exception is in Java as a subclass of Throwable and must be thrown in order to be activated. So you wouldn't say your program has an exception, but rather throws an exception. There's a throws keyword in Java that is used to declare that a method is able to throw an exception, meaning there's one or more lines within that method that can potentially lead to some exception being thrown. So exceptions are thrown and they're also caught. So we throw an exception and we catch an exception. If we don't catch a thrown exception, then our program crashes. That's the whole point, or one of the main points of catching exceptions, is to give our program a chance to continue on without crashing. So this catching of an exception is also called the handling of the exception. And going back to how exceptions are thrown, a line in your code has some error in it, and then when that piece of code is run, it triggers an exception object being created, a specific exception object that has some relation to the kind of error that's triggered. In this case, it'll be a file not found, specifically a file not found exception that's thrown if it can't find that file. Now, it's not necessarily an exception will be thrown here. If there is a file that is called no such file, then this code would run fine. But in the case that there isn't, then we'd have that exception thrown. And when you want to catch that exception, you would have to wrap the problematic code in a try-catch statement. It's specifically the catch that is handling the exception. You could have an exception handler that just catches all exceptions, or be equally specific and have some piece of code that specifically looks to catch, for example, here, the file not found exception. So just to summarize quickly, a piece of code in your program doesn't work or runs into some error, and then an exception object is created and thrown. It gets handed off to the runtime system, and the system looks down the call stack for any exception handler or any code that can catch the exception. And if it can't find it, or if it doesn't exist, the program crashes. If it does find it, it hands over control of the execution to that handler. And we'll see shortly how this looks in actual code, but the terminology was first important to understand.